She was the face of an entire era, and then the cameras stopped rolling. But Gloria Swanson didn't fade quietly. She was pushed aside by the very system she helped build. Her life didn't just inspire Sunset Boulevard, it exposed how Hollywood treats the women it no longer needs. So, how does someone go from studio royalty to a cautionary tale? Not just Norma Desmond. Gloria Swanson's real life was just as haunting. The final shot of Sunset Boulevard is unforgettable. Norma Desmond, draped in glitter, floats down her staircase. She's surrounded by cameras, lights, and police. She believes she's on a movie set. Her voice is calm. She stares ahead and says she's ready for her close-up. It's a disturbing moment. The audience watches a woman completely removed from reality. That final stare into the lens feels like she's talking directly to the viewers. It's one of the most chilling shots in film history. It became iconic because it wasn't just fiction. For many people watching, Norma Desmond felt real because Gloria Swanson was living something similar. In the 1920s, Gloria Swanson was one of the most recognizable stars in the world. She was at the top of the industry. Her movies made millions. Her style influenced fashion. She had power at a time when most women in Hollywood didn't. She wasn't just acting in hit films, she was shaping how films were made. She signed contracts with creative control. She worked closely with top directors. She even started producing her own projects. Swanson wasn't just another actress. She was a business force and a box office guarantee. She was also a symbol. Swanson represented the peak of silent cinema. She didn't need dialogue. She could carry an entire scene with one glance. Her face, her movement, and her timing told the story. Studios marketed her image as luxury, elegance, and star power. She became Paramount's most valuable name, and audiences came to see her name on the poster because her presence meant success. At her height, Paramount relied on her popularity to sell films. She helped define what a Hollywood star looked like. She was the face of an era. But Sunset Boulevard was not a victory lap. When Billy Wilder cast her as Norma Desmond, he gave her a role that resembled her past in uncomfortable ways. Norma is a former silent film star who's been forgotten by the studio system. She lives alone in her mansion watching her old movies, dreaming of a comeback that will never happen. She believes people are still waiting for her return. She doesn't understand why the phone stopped ringing. She thinks the public still adores her. She refuses to accept that Hollywood moved on. This wasn't far from Swanson's own life. By 1950, she had been away from leading film roles for years. The offers slowed. The studios weren't calling. She still worked in theater and television, but not on the scale she once knew. The film world that once praised her was no longer interested. The industry had moved forward. She wasn't considered part of its future. So, playing Norma Desmond was like acting out her own story. She didn't need to imagine the feeling of being discarded. She had lived through it. She knew what it meant to be remembered only for the past. She understood what it was like to be seen as a ghost of a former era. Her performance felt honest because she was pulling from personal experience. She was showing the audience what happens when a star becomes invisible. In a way, the movie blurred the line between Swanson and Norma. People watching saw the similarities. They wondered how much of it was performance and how much was memory. Swanson's delivery of each line had weight. It didn't sound like acting, it sounded like truth. When Norma says the pictures got small, it echoed what Swanson might have felt herself. The film wasn't just a story, it was a reflection of what the industry had done to her and others like her. Swanson received praise for her performance. Critics called it brave and powerful. She was nominated for an Oscar, but the recognition didn't lead to a full comeback. The roles offered after the film were often similar to Norma: older women, bitter characters, forgotten celebrities. Swanson didn't want to repeat herself. She didn't want to be stuck playing reminders of her own past. Her performance made her unforgettable again. But Hollywood wasn't interested in rebuilding her career. It was only interested in freezing her in place. That role gave her the spotlight one last time, but it didn't change the quiet decisions already made behind studio doors. Swanson wasn't just forgotten, she was pushed aside. And if you want to understand how that happened, you have to follow what the cameras weren't showing. The silent film machine chewed her up, and talkies sealed the deal. By the late 1920s, the film industry was changing fast. New technologies made it possible to record dialogue directly. Audiences wanted to hear voices. Studios invested in microphones, rewired theaters, and began producing sound films at full speed. The change wasn't gradual. It was immediate. Silent films didn't just fade, they were replaced. Actors who had built careers on expression had to adjust. Some struggled because their voices didn't match their screen image. Others couldn't deliver lines naturally. Swanson wasn't one of them. Her voice was strong, clear, and controlled. She had worked on stage before film. Speaking in front of a crowd wasn't new to her. She was ready to adapt. But adaptation wasn't always enough. The system had already started looking elsewhere. Studio heads wanted new stars to match the new era. They saw sound as an opportunity to refresh their rosters. Many silent film actors were pushed aside. It wasn't about talent, it was about market strategy. Studios didn't want their biggest talkie hits to be reminders of a previous generation. They wanted fresh faces with no silent film history attached. Swanson's value to studios dropped. She was no longer the future of cinema. She was tied to the past. Her style, though still effective, didn't match the tone of the newer films. Sound brought realism. Dialogue-driven stories needed a different rhythm. The grandeur of silent film acting seemed out of place in this new world. Directors stopped calling. Casting agents moved on. Scripts didn't come. But she still tried to adjust. She took on a few sound roles and tested different genres. But she didn't receive the same support she had in the silent era. The big budgets weren't offered. She wasn't given major roles with room to experiment. The system had already turned its attention elsewhere. Swanson chose to keep her standards. She didn't want to play characters that felt beneath her legacy. She passed on roles that didn't challenge her. That choice cost her. In a changing industry, refusing work was seen as difficult. The studios didn't see her as flexible. They labeled her outdated. Her career didn't collapse in public, it was reduced in private, one missed opportunity at a time. Other actresses were promoted with full marketing teams and new studio campaigns. Swanson was no longer included in those plans. She wasn't part of the conversations about what came next. The stars who filled theaters in the 1930s and 40s didn't share screens with her. Her name started fading from headlines. The people in charge knew her past, but they weren't building her future. She continued to work in different areas. Theater, radio, and television gave her space to perform, but she wasn't featured in major film productions anymore. Her appearances were limited and often treated as special occasions rather than career moves. Hollywood as a business had moved on. Her name still held respect, but it didn't command the same attention. By the time she reached her 40s, Swanson had been replaced by younger actresses with fresh contracts and new press agents. She was no longer the face of Paramount. She was no longer the actress producers built films around. The system didn't leave her with options, it moved past her without looking back. The transition to sound exposed how fragile a career in Hollywood could be. Fame didn't protect her. Success didn't guarantee continuity. When the system changed, the people in power decided who stayed and who didn't. Swanson wasn't given a second phase, she was closed out of it. She remained visible for a while, but not central. She went from being an essential part of the machine to someone the machine didn't need anymore. But for Swanson, it wasn't just about losing roles. It was about being told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that she was simply too old to matter. Hollywood's obsession with youth, the age trap. In the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood built its brand around youth. Young actresses were introduced constantly. Studios promoted them as fresh, exciting, and modern. Their images were carefully crafted. Their faces filled movie posters, magazine covers, and beauty ads. Studio heads believed audiences wanted to see youth on screen. That belief shaped casting decisions, studio contracts, and long-term careers. This created a narrow window of opportunity for women in film. Once an actress crossed into her late 30s, the roles changed. She was no longer seen as a romantic lead. Scripts began to offer her the part of the older sister, the mother, or the widow. These changes weren't based on ability, they were based on image. Actresses were told to adjust or disappear. If they refused to accept aging roles, they often stopped getting roles at all. For male actors, the rules were different. Men could age in public and still be cast as desirable. Leading men in their 40s and 50s regularly appeared opposite women who were 20 years younger. Their age added authority, experience, or charm. For women, aging was seen as a limitation. It reduced value instead of adding it. That gap became one of the clearest examples of how gender shaped opportunity in Hollywood. Actresses who aged out of the spotlight faced a hard choice. They could accept the shift and take supporting roles, or they could step away. Some tried to reinvent themselves on stage or in radio. Others were pushed into early retirement. Many found themselves playing mothers to characters who were close to their own age. In some cases, a woman would be offered grandmother roles before she turned 40. Gloria Swanson watched this happen around her. She saw actresses with long careers disappear quietly once they aged out of the studio's marketing plan. These were women who had once headlined films, walked red carpets, and signed autographs for crowds. Now they were background characters, if they worked at all. Swanson didn't want to follow that path. She also saw how the industry trained the public to expect youth. When people watched films, they got used to seeing 20-year-old women in love stories and 50-year-old men as heroes. That image became normal. Anything else felt strange to the audience. And when viewers started thinking an older actress looked too old for a role, studios responded by removing her. That pressure came from both the business side and the audience side. Even actresses who tried to maintain their image through surgery, makeup, and strict routines couldn't control the shift. The roles weren't there. Youth wasn't just preferred, it was required. Aging wasn't something to be managed. It was something to be hidden. That created a painful dynamic for actresses who had built their careers in front of the camera. Their job relied on being seen, but the industry told them to stop showing up. Some tried to work around the system. They accepted smaller roles, hoping to stay visible. Others left Hollywood entirely. A few took roles that exaggerated age, playing characters much older than themselves. But none of these options allowed for long-term career growth. The system didn't offer a way back. Once a woman was seen as old, she stayed that way in the eyes of the studios. This obsession with youth didn't come with a plan for longevity. Hollywood didn't know what to do with older actresses. It didn't invest in stories that featured them. It didn't build characters that reflected their experience. It simply moved on. Swanson had to decide whether to follow the path others took or carve out a new one for herself. She had worked hard to reach the top. She didn't want to be reduced to roles that made her invisible. She wanted creative control. She wanted to choose what she did and how she was seen. Accepting the roles offered to her would mean giving up that control. For Swanson, that wasn't an option. She was too powerful, and that made her dangerous. In the 1920s, Gloria Swanson wasn't just acting in movies, she was shaping them. She chose her scripts. She worked directly with directors. She even rejected roles that didn't match her standards. That level of control created tension in a system that was designed to keep stars in line. The studio model depended on actors being replaceable. Swanson didn't fit that mold. She refused to be shaped by marketing teams. She didn't take advice from publicists who wanted her to soften her image. She wasn't there to play the role of a cooperative employee. That kind of independence wasn't encouraged. It was seen as a threat. The industry wanted predictability. It didn't matter how talented someone was if they couldn't be controlled. Male producers expected loyalty. They preferred actors who followed instructions without question. Swanson questioned everything. She was outspoken and involved. She had opinions about lighting, pacing, and storylines. That kind of presence in meetings made her powerful, but it also made her a problem. People behind the scenes started to see her as difficult. She wasn't viewed as a team player. She was seen as someone who disrupted workflows. Studios began to treat her as a liability. They didn't want to fight for control every time they cast her. They wanted smooth productions with stars who stayed in their lanes. Industry gossip painted her as demanding. Some saw her as ungrateful for the fame she had. Others assumed she thought she was better than the system. These perceptions didn't help her reputation. They closed doors before scripts even reached her hands. So producers started to favor actresses who were easier to manage. These new faces came with fewer expectations. They followed directions, smiled at photographers, and stayed silent about decisions made without them. That's what the system wanted. That's what Swanson refused to become. Her choices cost her opportunities. People in power didn't want to work with someone who challenged their authority. Her name began to drop off casting lists. Directors who once praised her started avoiding conflict by hiring someone else. It wasn't about her talent, it was about her influence. She had too much of it. Swanson also had a strong sense of self. She didn't chase roles for the sake of staying visible. She turned down scripts that didn't interest her. She passed on parts that felt beneath her skill. This created the impression that she was hard to please. But from her point of view, she was protecting the quality of her work. She didn't want to be used. She wanted to be respected. The truth is, she operated in a way that men in her position were often praised for. Male stars who took control were called visionaries. Swanson was called stubborn. That double standard shaped how her power was received. She acted like a producer, but she was still treated like an actress. That mismatch made her career harder to sustain. But her ambition didn't fade. She continued to work on projects she cared about, but her role in the business had changed. She was no longer asked to lead productions. She wasn't invited to meetings where big films were discussed. She didn't lose her audience. She lost her place inside the structure that once celebrated her. That independence would come at a steep cost, especially when she took on a project that would haunt her for decades. The Kennedy scandal and the film that broke her. In the late 1920s, Gloria Swanson made a decision that changed the course of her career. She decided to take full control of a film project. The film was called Queen Kelly. It was supposed to be her next big moment, a lavish, silent epic that would re-establish her at the top. The story was dramatic and exotic, and the production was backed by Joseph P. Kennedy. Yes, the same Kennedy who would later become the father of a U.S. president. He was her business partner and also, at that time, her romantic partner. Kennedy wanted to invest in the movie business. Swanson gave him the opportunity to do that by letting him help fund Queen Kelly. The budget was large, expectations were high. Kennedy brought in Erich von Stroheim to direct. Stroheim was known for his detailed sets, long shoots, and obsessive creative control. His films had a history of running over time and over budget. Swanson admired his talent, but working with him quickly became a problem. From the start, the production was chaotic. Stroheim's methods slowed everything down. Scenes took days to shoot. The costumes were elaborate. The sets were expensive. The script kept changing. As the project dragged on, the budget swelled beyond what anyone had planned. Kennedy grew frustrated. Swanson tried to manage the situation, but Stroheim wouldn't compromise. He wanted to make his version of the film, regardless of cost or content. Then came the issue of the story itself. As the filming continued, Swanson discovered that Stroheim had added scenes that were much more risque than she expected. The content became a problem. One sequence showed Swanson's character forced into a sexual situation and later ending up in a brothel. That wasn't the story she had agreed to make. She thought it would ruin her image. When she saw the footage, she was horrified. Swanson demanded that the filming stop. Kennedy agreed. He fired Stroheim and shut the production down. By then, nearly a third of the film had been shot, but what existed was considered unreleasable in the U.S. The scenes were too explicit for the standards of American film boards. The project had already burned through most of its budget. What remained was a half-finished film, a lot of debt, and no way forward. Kennedy quietly pulled out of the project. He distanced himself from Swanson and the film. Publicly, he said little. Privately, he walked away from both the romance and the partnership. Swanson was left to handle the mess. She tried to salvage what she could. She had parts of the film edited for limited release overseas, but it didn't fix the damage. The film was mocked. People in the industry started calling it a disaster. It became a symbol of excess and mismanagement. Swanson lost more than money. Her reputation took a hit. She was once seen as a smart businesswoman. Now people said she had lost control. Industry gossip spread. Some blamed Stroheim. Others blamed Swanson for trusting him. Either way, her name became linked with failure. The film had been meant to mark her return. Instead, it marked her downfall. Studios began to see her differently. She was no longer considered a reliable star. She was considered risky. Her association with Kennedy, once a strength, became another complication. The scandal followed her. It appeared in columns and interviews. Even as she tried to move on, the shadow of Queen Kelly stayed with her. The failure of Queen Kelly was not just about the film itself, it revealed how little protection even a star like Swanson had when things went wrong. She had tried to take creative control. She had brought in a respected director. She had funding and vision. But the system didn't support her once it collapsed. She was left holding the blame. Swanson's career never fully recovered from Queen Kelly. She kept working, but she didn't return to the top. The movie stayed unreleased in the US for decades. It became a footnote in film history and a stain on her resume. For the rest of her life, Swanson answered questions about it. She never stopped feeling the weight of it. But Swanson's greatest punishment wasn't financial. It was reputational. Hollywood didn't forget or forgive. She refused to play the game, and that came at a cost. After the collapse of Queen Kelly, after the studios cooled and the budgets disappeared, she still had options. But they weren't the kinds of options she could take seriously. Hollywood had shifted, and Swanson had to decide, bend to it or step away from it. She chose not to play along. Offers still came in, but most were a shadow of what they used to be. Scripts landed on her table with roles that barely had names. Widowed mothers, aging spinsters, nervous housekeepers. These weren't characters, they were placeholders. She had once carried entire films as the emotional and visual center. Now they wanted her to serve the story of someone else. That didn't sit right with her. She rejected what she felt was hollow. She refused to deliver lines that didn't mean anything, or stand in scenes that reduced her presence to a plot device. It wasn't pride without purpose. She simply didn't see the point in returning to the screen just to be pushed to the side. The roles weren't written for her anymore, and the industry wasn't trying to create new ones. Saying no didn't make her difficult. It made her invisible. Studios started to look elsewhere. They prioritized actresses who were willing to do what Swanson wouldn't: smile, accept the limitations, and pretend not to notice that the ceiling was lower than before. Directors didn't want conversations about rewrites or character depth. Producers didn't want someone with ideas, and Swanson had plenty. In earlier decades, her voice had carried weight. She had chosen her costumes, her scripts, even her co-stars. She had negotiated directly with studio heads. That kind of control was rare then and almost unheard of now, especially for a woman over 40. Her refusal to shrink made her less employable. So, she started exploring other creative spaces. Theater offered more substance, more space to explore complex characters. Television gave her opportunities to work without compromising as much. She tried new projects, invested time in design, fashion, even health and wellness ideas. Her life stayed full. But when it came to films, the center of her legacy, she was mostly absent. The distance grew slowly. At first, she was busy with other things. Then the offers came less often. Then they stopped altogether. Not because she failed, but because she didn't follow the new rules. She didn't want to settle. She didn't want to be in movies just to prove she was still alive. That decision made sense to her. It also cost her decades of film work. Executives started describing her as a risk. New productions avoided anything that hinted at complexity. Casting a former star came with questions. What would she want? Would she ask for input? Would she resist direction? These were the wrong questions, but they were enough to keep her out of the room. It wasn't her personality that blocked her return. It was the myth of her personality, shaped by people who didn't understand her work. And while she held her ground, the whispers started growing louder in the background. The press loved her until they didn't. At the height of her fame, Gloria Swanson didn't need to chase the press. They followed her everywhere. Reporters lined up outside premieres just to catch a glimpse. Magazines ran full spreads of her gowns, her jewels, her signature looks. She gave interviews that became headlines. Her quotes were sharp, her presence impossible to ignore. Photographers didn't just cover her, they competed for her. She knew how to pose, how to speak, how to make her life feel like a story worth printing. And the press rewarded that by turning her into one of the most visible women in America. She understood the media as well as any publicist. Every photograph she posed for and every detail she shared was part of the image she built. She wasn't just a movie star. She was a brand before Hollywood had that word. And for a long time, it worked. She was talked about with respect. Her elegance was celebrated, her wit quoted. She wasn't just covered, she was admired. But that relationship wasn't built on loyalty, it was built on usefulness. And when the industry changed and newer faces began to take the spotlight, the media shifted with it. They didn't ignore Swanson right away. They simply changed how they talked about her. Instead of praising her, they questioned her. Instead of style pieces, they ran speculation. They still used her name, but not to celebrate. They used it as contrast, as an example of what used to be. Subtle at first, the shift crept in through side remarks and tone changes. A profile that once would have called her iconic now described her as once famous. A gossip column noted how she was seen dining alone. A review compared a rising star to Swanson in her decline. The framing changed, and with it, the public started seeing her differently. She hadn't changed. The way people talked about her had. The headlines got colder. Instead of interviews about her craft, they focused on her age. Journalists brought up old relationships, financial rumors, and failed projects, while ignoring what she was still working on. The press built a version of her that was frozen in the past, someone who didn't know when to step aside. They stopped asking what she was doing now and only talked about what she used to do. Her presence in the news felt more like a warning than a tribute. Even the smallest decisions were magnified. A dress that once would have been praised for glamour was now trying too hard. Her confidence was called arrogance. Her refusal to take humiliating roles was spun as bitterness. There was no interest in her perspective. The industry no longer saw her as part of its future, and the media followed suit. Public opinion began to mirror those narratives. She became someone people gossiped about, not someone they listened to. Writers built a version of Swanson that fit the kind of story they could sell, one of decline, vanity, and delusion. They left out the context. They didn't talk about her independence, her production work, her business decisions, or the choices she made to maintain control of her image. They erased the full picture and replaced it with an easy headline. When she stayed quiet, they made assumptions. When she spoke up, they twisted it. Either way, the story was already written before she opened her mouth. The press didn't need a major scandal to turn on her. All they needed was an audience more interested in new faces. When that shift happened, editors stopped assigning features. News programs stopped inviting her on air. She didn't become invisible overnight, but her relevance was slowly drained by the way she was talked about, or ignored altogether. Even when her name appeared, it was usually as a reference point in stories about aging stars or forgotten legends. She showed up in retrospective lists, not active conversations. They got the details wrong, but it didn't matter. The effect was the same. People began to see her as a relic, not because of who she was, but because of how she was framed. Hollywood didn't need to publicly cast her out. The press did the quiet work, and by the time Billy Wilder handed her a script that looked like a brutal reflection of her life, most assumed she'd never accept it. They thought she'd be offended. They thought she'd protect her image. They were wrong. She read the script and said yes. The role that was too perfect to be fiction. When Billy Wilder started putting together Sunset Boulevard, he wasn't just casting a movie, he was digging up old Hollywood. The film needed someone who could do more than act. He needed someone who had lived the highs and survived the fall. Norma Desmond wasn't just a fictional has-been. She was a mirror held up to every star who'd once stood under the spotlight and now lived in the shadows of their own past. It was a role that demanded more than talent. It demanded truth. Wilder and his team went through a long list of names. Mary Pickford was the first dream choice, but she turned it down instantly. Greta Garbo wanted nothing to do with it. Mae West reportedly thought the character was too depressing. Nobody wanted to step into the skin of a woman the world had moved on from. The role hit too close to home. It wasn't just about pretending to be forgotten. For many of these women, it was their reality. They didn't want to make art out of something that still stung. Gloria Swanson hadn't been the first name tossed around, but she started to make sense the more they struggled to find someone willing. She had been huge in the silent film era, one of the biggest. She was once the crown jewel of Paramount Pictures, the face on posters, the woman everyone wanted to be or be with. But by the time Wilder came calling, she hadn't starred in a major film in over a decade. Her name still carried weight, but not the kind that opened studio doors anymore. When Wilder and Paramount finally reached out, Swanson didn't feel flattered. She felt insulted. They wanted her to audition. It was like asking a queen to prove she could still wear the crown. She'd been one of the highest-paid women in the country. She'd carried Paramount on her back during its early years. And now they wanted a screen test? That hurt. It was a reminder of how far she'd fallen in the eyes of an industry that once treated her like royalty. But after the initial sting, she read the script. And she saw what Wilder was really doing. Norma wasn't just a joke. She wasn't a caricature of a delusional old woman. She was layered, messy, and painfully real. Her desperation didn't come out of nowhere. It had roots, emotional ones. Norma was scared. She was lonely. She was still trying to matter in a world that had stopped listening. Swanson didn't need to stretch her imagination to understand any of that. She knew what that silence felt like, so she said yes. She stepped onto that set and gave everything she had to the role. She didn't play Norma with bitterness, she played her with heartbreak. She gave the character dignity even in her most desperate moments. That line, "I am big, it's the pictures that got small," was more than just dialogue. It was a statement. It was Swanson saying, "I never stopped being good at this. You just stopped looking." The cast and crew knew they were watching something special. Wilder let her take ownership of the performance. He didn't micromanage. He stood back and watched it happen. When they filmed that final scene, Norma descending the staircase, fully lost in her fantasy, the room froze. No one moved. No one whispered. The air felt thick. She was locked in, and everyone else was caught in the gravity of it. When Wilder called cut, the crew didn't just applaud, they cheered. Some of them cried. Swanson's performance wasn't just acting. It was memory, pain, pride, and defiance rolled into one. She wasn't mocking Norma, she was honoring her. And in doing that, she honored herself too. Every frame of that film felt like a reckoning with her own legacy. That final look into the camera didn't feel like a line reading. It felt like a confrontation. She was staring at everyone who dismissed her, ignored her, underestimated her. And for a moment, they had to look back. They had to remember what she'd once been and still was. Swanson didn't just resurrect her career with Sunset Boulevard. She reminded the world why she mattered in the first place, not through nostalgia, but through undeniable skill. She made the audience feel something sharp and unforgettable, and she did it with no apologies. From Outcast to icon, how time did what Hollywood wouldn't. By the time the film industry started re-examining its past, Gloria Swanson had already lived through being both worshipped and forgotten. But history has a habit of circling back, especially when the truth sticks around longer than gossip. The same actress Hollywood once avoided was now being recognized as someone ahead of her time, an example of what it meant to survive a system that rarely let women age, think, or lead on their own terms. Swanson's return to public conversation wasn't just about nostalgia. It was about people beginning to realize that her story wasn't one of downfall, but of resistance. Decades after her last starring roles, she was finally being seen as more than the face of a forgotten era. She was becoming a symbol of something bigger, a woman who didn't vanish quietly even when she was supposed to. Film scholars started to revisit her career in the 1970s and 80s, especially as the conversation around women in Hollywood began to change. Feminist critics looked back and saw something remarkable. Swanson had taken control of her image when most women in the industry had no say. She produced her own films in the 1920s. She turned down roles that insulted her. She didn't play the game the way they wanted, and for that, she paid the price. But time started shifting the lens. Instead of seeing her choices as arrogance or stubbornness, critics now saw agency and courage. Younger actresses and filmmakers also took notice. When people in the industry began to speak more openly about how difficult it was to maintain careers as women past 40, Swanson's story suddenly felt familiar. The pressure to stay marketable, the fear of being seen as too old, the way confidence is mistaken for arrogance when it comes from a woman. Swanson had gone through all of it decades earlier and had faced it alone, with no movement or hashtag behind her. Her legacy was now being taught as a lesson in power, gender, and survival. She also became a style icon again, oddly enough. Archival footage and old photo spreads circulated in fashion magazines and retrospectives, Her dramatic costumes, especially from her silent films, became part of visual studies in design schools. Her look in Sunset Boulevard, once seen as grotesque and overdone, was now appreciated for its intentional symbolism. Costume historians analyzed her wardrobe the same way film critics analyzed her monologues. By the 1990s, Swanson's name no longer just referred to a relic of the past. It represented a model of what it meant to fight for respect in a system that only gives it conditionally. She didn't stop working after Hollywood sidelined her. She just stopped waiting for their approval. She wrote books, appeared on television, engaged in politics, and mentored younger performers. She lived out loud in the way the industry had tried to silence. Her later interviews revealed a woman still sharp, still witty, and still aware of how the game had been rigged. Even in death, the reevaluation continued. Modern documentaries on women in film history often include segments about Swanson. Her work has been restored, archived, and reissued. Film festivals run retrospectives in her name. She's been quoted in speeches by actresses pushing for more power in the industry. What once was a cautionary tale had flipped completely. She was now being held up as a case study in persistence. The contrast between how she was seen in the 1950s and how she is remembered now is striking. Then, she was the woman who couldn't let go. Today, she's seen as the one who wouldn't give in. That shift didn't come from studio executives or press agents or award shows. It came from time. And it came from people slowly realizing that Swanson had been telling the truth the entire time. She never asked for sympathy. She didn't beg for roles. She didn't try to charm her way back into the system. She moved forward with whatever tools she had left. Sometimes that was her voice. Sometimes it was her sharpness. Sometimes it was just her ability to stay visible long enough for people to see her clearly. Swanson didn't return to Hollywood the way others had. She didn't get a string of comeback roles. She didn't become the beloved elder stateswoman of the silver screen. She became something more powerful, an icon. Not because she played the game well, but because she showed everyone what happens when the rules are broken and you keep going anyway. Her story still matters because it keeps repeating. Every time a woman is told she's too much, too old, or too complicated, it echoes Swanson's past. And every time one of them refuses to disappear, it proves she was never wrong for wanting more. Hollywood may have cast her aside. Time put her right back in the spotlight. The question is, how many more Gloria Swansons will we ignore before we finally change the script? So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments down below.